Eileen Myles and Stéphanie Lacava, and I thank them warmly for accepting our invitation. I would like to thank also our interpreter, Nicholas Elliott. The timing couldn't be better since Constance's novel Love Me Tender, translated by Holly James, has just been published by Semiotext in the United States a few weeks ago, while Eileen has just returned from a tour in France from the French translation of her cult book Chelsea Girls, translated by Héloïse Esquier and published in France by Éditions du Sous-Sol. But I will leave it to our moderator, Stéphanie Lacava, to introduce them both in more details. I will overtake the time to say a few words about you, Stéphanie, who was pleased to accept our invitation and also has a book that has just been published a few weeks ago, I think. So, an American writer and publisher, Stéphanie Lacava grew up in France and is now based in New York City. After studying international relations and economics, she began publishing her writing in journals like Harper's, the New York Times, and the New York Review of Books, to name only a few. In 2016, she founded The Small Press, an independent publishing house of new works in translation and artist-led visual narrative for children and adults. Her first novel, The Super Rationals, was published in 2020 by Semiotext, and her newest novel, I Fear My Pen Interests You, was published last month by Verso Books. This new absurdist novel talks about pen, relationships, and family. So before passing the mic to Stéphanie, I would like to remind you that this will be a discussion for about 45 minutes, and this will be followed by a Q&A, a 15-minute Q&A session. So Stéphanie, the floor is yours. Thank you.
You can hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you everyone for coming. I'm going to read a little introduction to both of our authors to start off, and we're going to start with Eileen. Eileen was born in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and was educated at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. They moved to New York City in 1974 to be a poet and subsequently a novelist, art journalist, and writer of libretti. As Sagittarius, their 22 books include For Now, Evolution, Afterglow, I Must Be Living Twice, New and Selected Poems, and Chelsea Girls. In 2019, they wrote and directed an 18-minute Super 8 film, a puppet role film. Myles is the recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship, an Anti-Warhol Creative Capital Arts Writers Grant, 4 Lambda Book Awards, the Shelley Prize from the Poetry Society of America, and a Poetry Award from the Foundation for Contemporary Arts. In 2016, Myles received a Creative Capital Grant and the Clark Prize for Excellence in Art Writing. In 2019, Myles received a Poetry Award from the American Academy of Arts and Letters. In 2020, they got the Bill Whitehead Award for Lifetime Achievement from the Publishing Triangle. They live in New York City and Marfa, Texas. All true. And now for Constance. The daughter of an illustrious French family whose members include a former prime minister, a model, and a journalist, Constance Debré abandoned her marriage and legal career as a defense lawyer in 2015 to write full-time and begin relationships with women. Her transformation from affluent career woman to single lesbian was chronicled in her 2018 novel, Playboy, praised by Virginie Despentes for its writing that is at once flippant and consumed by anxiety. Since then, she has written Love Me Tender and No. Writing graphically about sex, rupture, longing, and despair in the first person, Debré's work is often compared with the punk-era writings of Guillaume Toussaint and Hervé Guibert, whose work she has championed. As she says of Guibert, I love him because he says I, and he's a pornographer. That seems to be essential when you write, otherwise you don't say anything. But in Love Me Tender, Debré speaks courageously of love in its many forms, reframing what it means to be a mother beyond conventional expectations. Thank you for being here. So I wanted to start because you guys both have works out in translation in different places. I would like to start with Eileen, to hear about your experience when you were in France and the media reception of Chelsea Girls, which first came out here in '94, right? And then in 2015, and now is published by Editions du Sol for the first time. You can find a few more.
Yeah. I couldn't see the on button, but different model. I felt like having a book come out in France was radically different from having a book come out in the States. Like the kind of conversations I had with journalists were actually really sort of deep.
Oh, tell me more about that.
Well, people brought their whole sense of literature. I mean, it wasn't just cultural. It was actually, people really wanted to not talk about the book being written and other books, and sexuality came up too, in New York versus France and things like that. But it was a much more hearty intellectual experience. I mean, it just was a really different. It was a different take on literature, and of course then the publisher sends me the reviews, and I'm like, great, because I don't read French, but and then I was, kind of trolling through, Google Translate, getting these very weird translations of what, but they seemed pretty good too. I mean, I was just like, I just found the journalists very smart.
Really good.
Huh?
I think they were really good.
Yeah. I believe the publisher, but I think, so it was. I mean, I think even, for me, I think I probably had a burst of publicity in 2015 and 2016 when Chelsea Girls got reissued, but it was all about personality, and it was all about who I was and why was this happening and who is this person, and it really was not much about the work at all, So I did feel the experience of being received in France was very different.
Constance, do you have anything to say about that from your perspective? I know it's that the book is newly out, so you haven't had as much of an interaction with the American media. Yeah,
I'm going to speak in French.
Okay, perfect. Yeah.
Mais en tout cas, je ne sais pas encore, puisque le livre vient de sortir et je n'ai pas eu d'interaction avec des journalistes américains. D'abord, c'est un grand plaisir d'être publié ici, pour beaucoup de raisons, mais aussi parce que je crois que les écrivains français, et en tout cas moi, ont été très influencés par certains écrivains américains, dont Eileen Myles, et leur manière d'écrire nous a, je crois, fait beaucoup de bien. Enfin, en tout cas, moi, je crois que c'est très important, donc j'aime bien ce retour. Voilà. Et d'autre part, je crois qu'il y a aussi, pour revenir sur ce que disait Eileen, c'est quand on écrit à la première personne, et tant mieux si c'est moins le cas en France, mais moi, c'est pas toujours ce que j'ai senti, mais quand on écrit à la première personne, il y a toujours un risque de confusion, évidemment, entre le travail qu'on fait et notre histoire. Notre histoire, notre matière, c'est parti. Pardon.
I don't know yet because my book is just out here, so I really haven't had any interactions with US journalists yet. But first I'll say it's a great pleasure to be published here for many reasons, but also because I think that French contemporary writers, and especially myself, are very influenced by American writers, and notably Eileen. And I think that these American writers have done us, French writers, a great deal of good. In any case, they have done me a great deal of good. And there's therefore something I like about this return, or coming to the United States in return. Now, regarding what Eileen said about writing in the first person, I'm very glad if what Eileen experienced in France is true, but in my case, it hasn't always been the case. There is this danger when you write in the first person that there will be a confusion between your work and your personal history.
En fait, c'est d'autant plus vrai que quand on écrit à la première personne de façon, et comme le fait Eileen, et ça c'est une chose que j'aime beaucoup, très directe, très comme si c'était simple, voilà, comme si c'était simple, vraiment straight to the point et matter of fact. On a l'impression que c'est comme ça que c'est vrai. En fait, on oublie le travail. Or, ça n'est que du travail. Et pour écrire comme ça, il faut une immense distance. Et voilà, donc il y a parfois cette confusion, mais c'est une confusion, c'est une ambiguïté sans doute dont on se sert aussi quand on écrit à la première personne et qui fait aussi sans doute sa force parce qu'il y a à mon sens, un risque accru et une responsabilité accrue de l'auteur de ces phrases. C'est quelque chose évidemment, qui me plaît. Quand il y a du risque, il y a quelque chose d'un peu excitant.
This is especially true when you write in the first person the way Eileen Myles does, and this is something that I really like about Eileen's work. When you write in the first person in a very direct way, as if it were simple, writing to the point, matter of fact, and what that does actually is that it makes you forget the work. It makes the reader forget the work when in fact it is nothing but work. And so, because when you write like that, what you need is a tremendous amount of distance. So indeed, there can be this confusion, and what I do is I use that ambiguity that you get when you're writing in the first person, and I think that is actually the strength of this kind of writing. It increases the risk, and it increases the author's responsibility to their sentence. And of course, I like risk. I find it exciting.
I mean, I think what you just said is perfectly true. That the writer becomes invisible by doing that kind of work. And then within the work, you're deeply visible, and to a kind of a reception, you're visible in a wrong way. But you got the contradiction. Exactly.
Do you, in terms of between the space between the private and the personal, do you feel that it's different in the French literary tradition than in the American literary tradition? Or even I guess we could also say that, do you feel that, in your experience when you were asked questions by journalists, were they interested more in the personal or more in the work, and therefore that also showed, where the interest lied, whether it was about your actual life or?
I mean, the personal came up, but I did feel like they were actually engaging with the work in a way that seemed really special. But I do think that what was the beginning of the question? Was about comparing France?
Versus, yes, comparing the literary tradition.
Oh, I think it's very similar. I think it's actually really similar. I mean, the work that uses the self, that uses the I think it probably has the same difficulties and the same purposes. And when I think of somebody like Villa Albertine, who's so important to me, that was so easy in the room. We were all sitting in the room before we came down. We all just agreed, yes, Villa Albertine, she's like it, and she's one of those examples of a fiction, non-fiction writer who is writing right on the edge, or Hervé Goubert, and endless writers that I can think of, who are American writers who write in first person.
So many.
Yeah. Bob Clark, Lynn Tillman, Michelle T, myself.
Also, in terms of conversational language in the writing, like in terms of that, do you feel that was, sorry, 1 second, let me just see what I have here. Okay, actually I wanted to ask you about your thoughts on risk in relation to what Constance just said in the writing. Like, do you have
Yeah, I mean, I think the risk is being considered a pornographer. If you write about, I feel like I get credit for writing about sex much more than I write about sex. But it's like if you write about sex, it's just like a little bit of lavender ink into an aquarium, like all the water suddenly becomes slightly lavender, And I think it's, I can think of other writers. If you use your own name in the work and then you write about sex, it's just dirty, And I think it becomes a problem for how you're received as a writer. I think because that's, the fourth wall is not made for us. I think among writers, we all know that it's there. And, and it's always strange when somebody comes up to you after reading and says something completely personal about your work because they assume that you're it.
Right.
But I think that's a common assumption.
Also, you said before that the act of writing is sort of like a body language, like it's something done with your entire body. And I was interested in that from your perspective as well, because I feel that very much in your work as well.
Yes, I agree.
Yeah, and I wanted to know if you could speak a little bit about that, about it, the process being really from the body. Almost like a dance, maybe, perhaps, or something like that.
Oh, I don't dance. But, oui, j'aime bien penser à la littérature, la littérature, disons, comme quelque chose qui, je reviens à cette idée de risque et de responsabilité qui engage, et cette idée qu'il faut mettre son corps dans les pages, c'est-à-dire il faut et je trouve que c'est que si on ne prend pas ce risque-là, je crois que c'est ça aussi qui peut séduire le lecteur. Moi, c'est quelque chose que j'aime bien comme lectrice, de recevoir autant que possible la totalité de celui qui écrit. Oui, je dirais que c'est ça. Pour moi, c'est un geste. C'est vraiment, il y a quelque chose de cet ordre-là.
I feel that between both of you.
Can I try?
Yeah.
Yes.
No problem.
Tell me.
Yes, I like to think of literature, let's say, as something, to come back to this idea of risk and responsibility, that engages you, that commits you. It's the idea of putting the body into the pages. I think if you don't take that risk, it's something that you can also seduce the reader with. I, as a reader, like to receive as much as possible the totality of the person writing. I'd say it's that. It's a gesture.
Eileen, do you have thoughts about that?
I was fascinated.
It's amazing.
That's my gesture.
But I think you started to ask me a question earlier, and I thought you were going to say something about vernacular or speech.
Yes, I was. And I got nervous that I shouldn't ask that question.
No, that was a great question,
Okay.
but it connects to what we're saying here too.
Yes.
That was my one fear in France, because I didn't know about the translation, and so I didn't know to what extent the American vernacular is very
So much of your work is conversation.
And I'm writing through class, too,
Yeah.
across class, and so I had no idea, and I didn't have many conversations about that, and so I didn't know if that was received, but that is, to me, that is the body and the writing. It's sort of like, I'll have a story for a very long time that I want to write, and I can't write it because I don't know who writes it or what writes it, but mostly I'm looking for a rhythm. And the rhythm is entirely visceral. And once the rhythm comes, you're just pouring, which is an experience I have of your work, that I think it seems, that's why I wrote such a short blurb on your book. That's exhilarating, because I sat down on a train and I had a printed out PDF, and I just couldn't stop reading, because it felt like one long sentence, because it had that kind of carried by itself feeling. And I think that's what the kind of writing I do, and what I found in the work that you're doing was, so it was exhilarating, because it's an act. The mind. There are so many writers that I adore, and when I read them, I stop all the time. Like Robert Walser, I adore, but I keep stopping because I feel like it's very cerebral. It's an interrupted body, and it's just very uncomfortable. But I felt like that wasn't what was happening in your work, and I don't think. Mine is very cut up, and yet I still feel like it's pouring.
I love that notion of pouring. It reminds me of once we had a conversation, you mentioned this idea of a collecting intelligence on the page. And I feel that almost in both of your work as well, that something that comes through that's not exactly the work itself, but like a collective feeling or thought. And maybe that's a little bit, can you speak a little bit to that as well? Like what's the between the lines of, or is it all intuitive to you, or do you, actually maybe a better question is, do you cut afterward, or do you sort of lay it all out first hand, or what's your process like in that way?
Both, totally both. But I think that I learned from a girlfriend from a long time ago who was a filmmaker, and it was when people were making Super 8 films, but you were still using film, and so it was expensive, and so you had to get good with the camera, you know, and so there was this idea of editing in the camera, that while you were shooting, you were, you know, putting the button on and off because film was expensive and you couldn't waste too much film. And I think with writing, I feel like the longer you write and you keep writing, the more you get better at not saying certain things while you're going. So you're in motion and you're stopped and you're moving around obstacles of things you don't want to say, things that you know would stop you, things that would derail you. And it's such an act of really running through a field, jumping over holes and things to keep going.
Oui, je suis d'accord. Je pense que je passe 90%, ça ne veut rien dire, mais 90% de mon temps à éditer, en fait, beaucoup plus qu'à produire de la matière. C'est pour ça que mes livres sont courts, peut-être. Mais oui, parce que je reviens sur ce que disait Eileen à l'instant. Oui, le corps, c'est la langue, en fait. Et donc, elle est là, mais je la retravaille pour qu'on la sente le moins possible, d'une certaine manière. Voilà, qu'on ne voit pas la langue, qu'on ne voit pas les mots, mais qu'on soit attrapé par quelque chose. C'est ça que j'essaye de faire.
I agree. I think that I spend about 90% of my time editing rather than producing material. Maybe that's why my books are short. And to come back to what Eileen was just saying, yes, the body is the language. It's there, but I rework it so that it is felt as little as possible, so that we don't see the language or the words, but that we are caught by something. In any case, that's what I try to do.
Something else that I think about when I think of both of your work is that there's this intense, talking about what comes between the lines in terms of feeling, there's this intense sort of self-belief, this feeling that you know what you're doing is what you're supposed to be doing, and it's at that moment. I think that that's a really sort of special and unique thing that comes through in the work, and it comes through also when I think of Chelsea Girls and I think of the stories of you when you were younger. I feel very much so that you knew then too. Like the same kind of self-belief comes through of being a writer, of freedom. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Well, I feel like the earlier stuff in Chelsea Girls was like basically putting a voice track onto things that were visual memories. Because I think as a child, you're just recording all the time. You don't miss anything. People always act like kids don't know what's going on. I think kids are sort of smarter than the room, pretty much, and kids see everything. But so I think all those recordings exist in your mind, and I think the thing that's exciting about it, being an adult and a writer, is then you get to tape the voiceover onto the visual memories, and even use it as an editing device.
I just, I flipped open to this one page as an example that I had underlined, where you say, I was a great poet and I would always be alone in this story, where you also talk about New York, so I want to talk about New York, and this is from 1982, and that for me was an example of that kind of, that comes through, that self-belief, and I feel that in your work too, those kind of statements. That very sort of strong feeling of, this is what you're supposed to be doing at that moment. Do you have a feeling?
Oui, mais ça, c'est quelque chose que j'adore chez Eileen aussi, c'est cette autorité, je dirais. Pour moi, c'est un parti pris de travail, c'est d'avancer par statements et de présenter le narrateur ou la narratrice. Qui est à partir de moi, d'accord, ça on a compris, mais est aussi un héros. Et ça, il y a peut-être quelque chose d'enfantin, mais quelque chose qui est, à mon avis, au cœur de la littérature. Et j'aime bien justement quand c'est à partir de la première personne, dire d'accord, je vais aller jusqu'au bout de cette chose-là avec son arrogance, qui est d'en faire un héros et donc d'avancer comme un héros. Voilà, sans que ce soit évidemment sans échapper à la complexité, mais j'aime bien qu'il y ait ça aussi, parce que je crois que c'est aussi ça qui permet au lecteur d'être encore une fois attiré par ce qu'on écrit et par le personnage. C'est aussi mettre en scène un personnage, peu importe que ce soit vraiment moi, je vais pas m'exprimer. À partir du moment où j'écris, je fais cette chose-là, je vais raconter des choses qui sont personnelles, et j'ai écrit à la première personne. Alors il faut assumer la chose complètement. Et bien sûr, je vais me mettre en scène comme un héros, et un héros, qu'est-ce que c'est ? C'est quelqu'un qui avance. Voilà. Donc je vais pas raconter, mes doutes. Enfin, moi, j'aime pas. En tout cas, la littérature que j'ai faite jusque-là et qui m'intéresse, c'est pas celle qui. C'est pas la littérature psychologisante. Donc la question du statement pour moi, mais c'est pareil, c'est la question du geste, c'est la question de la responsabilité. Et, parce que je crois aussi qu'on aime ce qui est séduisant, et après je m'arrête. Ce qui est séduisant, encore une fois, c'est quand on est dans un tel doute constant et chaotique dans nos journées, quand quelque chose vous attrape, que quelqu'un vous dit tiens, viens. Voilà, ça c'est génial. Et c'est ce que j'essaye de faire dans les livres aussi. Ah.
That's something I love in Eileen's work, which is that authority. It's a decision or a position regarding the work to move forward by statements. Yes, we know that my narrator is based on me or starts from me, but my narrator is also a hero. There's something childlike about that, but I think that it's at the heart of literature. And so when you're working in the first person, I like to go all the way with that, to go all the way to the end of that, which is to say that I make the narrator a hero, and the narrator advances or moves forward like a hero, without, of course, avoiding the complexity. But I also like having this hero to allow the reader to feel drawn by what I write, to be attracted to a character. Yes, I write in the first person, but writing in the first person also means staging the character, staging the hero, and the hero moves forward. I'm not going to tell you about my doubts, my anxiety. What I like in literature and what I do in literature is not psychological. It's this literature of the gesture. What I find so seductive, for instance, if you're having a chaotic moment in the course of a day, is to have someone grab you and say, come. And that's what I try to do with my books.
That was great. Yeah, I guess the only thing I wanted to add was my short version of something like that is that you throw it down and then you have to live up to it. You know, I mean, it's just, and I think there were, obviously there were writers when I was young. Gertrude Stein proclaimed, and I was like, how can she do that? And then she went forward. It was this beautiful voice print of proclamation that was again and again. And also another writer, it's very interesting because I think he has a French-American, Henry Miller, is really,
I love him.
Yeah, life-changing, and right away, asshole attitude. And I was like, can you say that? And then the rest of the book unraveled that thought and took it on a vacation and went all over the world and became a writer,
I really do feel that you both have that kind of authoritative voice that draws you in and does seduce you and feels in charge of what's happening on the page. And I love that you mentioned, and even what you just said as well, I feel it very, very strongly in your work. When you mentioned I'm just curious, not talking about the anxieties and doubts, tell me a little bit more about that.
And maybe to show them, to make the reader feels them, but not to write about them. I don't like to write about feeling so much. I like the reader to feel the feelings.
What do you think about that?
Well, I mean, I think when I think about your work, and I was thinking about your work while you were talking, and Yeah, I think your work is extremely performative, you know, and so it is. I mean, I think when I was reading the Icelandic sagas a few years ago, and writing about them, they were saying that the sagas were not psychological. There was all action. It was pure action, and I think there is that about the one book of yours that I've read, and it reminds me too of Chris Kraus. I mean, Chris Kraus is another, because I Love Dick is an abject action that then she just enacts through the course of the book. You know, it's an act of supreme female masochism by which she takes power. You know, and I think there's a divesting in your work. It's a long divesting, at least in this book, of changing shapes, changing spaces, changing styles with this kind of very driven impetus, which even isn't entirely clear what the impetus is, but the person will not stop moving, you know, and that seems like the motive of the book.
Is there ever a moment when you felt doubt writing this book?
Probably all the time, yes, of course.
Because you don't feel it, but you don't feel it in the work. Yeah, that's the performance.
No, that's, I mean, there's a... Yes, I mean, I wanted, I don't know, there's doubt and a kind of assurance and the absolute will to do it and to finish it and to, yes, that's the
when you started
thrill of it, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah, no.
And let's talk a little bit about freedom, because the title of this talk, and I feel like that's a good segue into that as well. When you say that the thrill of writing it, and there's definitely a sense of, you know, this thrilling kind of freedom on the page in both of the works, where you're, you know, committing, as you said, to this you know, this hero, this journey, this story, and I'm curious about what you feel though you have to leave behind in your, like in your personal life, in your real life, because there's many moments in both books where I feel that there are things that are said like, you know, I sort of agreed to myself that I was going to leave behind these comforts for X, Y, and Z, or the things that I required were cigarettes, rent, coffee. There's one line in Chelsea Girls, I believe, and I want to hear more about what you feel you're letting go of in order to write this way. Like, what gives you the freedom to do this? Or I can say it clearer if that's not as...
I mean, when I think about freedom, I just feel like each book of mine has had a different kind of freedom and a different desire for freedom. And I think Chelsea Girls was like making up the freedom of being a writer. You know, like I didn't know while I was writing the book if I could write the book while I was writing the book, you know, and I wrote it over years, you know. And yet it was really coming out of the excitement of at last having this space of being a writer with myself and being alone and being in New York and being of a certain age and having left a lot of things behind and nobody could see me and, you know, in my private place, and I could do any fucking thing I wanted. And what I chose to do was write a novel, you know, that didn't even know if it was a novel or not, you know. So the thrill of writing that book was its own becoming, and whether this book can be, and out of these raw circumstances, which were my life, and yet they all felt like secret places that astonished me. And I thought if I assembled them, then it would make this thing. And I didn't know what that thing was, but I was going to make it and create it. Each book I've written has had a different, you know, like when I wrote a book about a dog dying, it was such a surrender to a death of another creature that I loved, and I had never surrendered to love before, and I had never surrendered to dying before, and to see it thoroughly in all its dimensions, and you know, and it wound up being an exercise in writing, because then you would use all the tools you had in your imagination and your body and your heart to keep being with this thing, even if it meant going on fantastic trips away from the thing that was happening as a way to stay with it, you know. So it was, you know, the freedom of that was the freedom of relationship, I suppose, you know.
I like what you said too about how you worked the thrill into, it seems like there was a bit of a thrill also in the creation of Chelsea Girls in a similar way, that you both share that in terms of what the driving force behind those two works. Do you have any thoughts on the freedom aspect?
Yes. je suis d'accord pour dire que les choses... Enfin, moi aussi, en tout cas, moi, à partir du moment où j'ai commencé à écrire, tout à coup, ça s'est ouvert. C'était quelque chose, comme beaucoup, que je traînais dans mes poches. Mais voilà, tout à coup, à un moment, j'ai su. Il m'a semblé que je savais. Et donc, à cet instant, il n'était pas question de perdre une seconde et de faire autre chose, c'est tout. J'ai un tempérament un peu obsessionnel, disons, et donc j'ai fait ça. Alors, ensuite, les conséquences ne sont pas grand-chose. Et là encore, l'image du héros est très utile. C'est pour ça que c'est pas juste quelque chose d'enfantin. Le roman, enfin les livres, sont, à mon avis, un exercice spirituel, comme disait Loyola, ou un aspect moral. Et le héros, c'est quoi? Enfin, on peut reprendre effectivement Ulysse, le premier. C'est celui qui part, d'une part, et ce qui le fait, et en partant... Pardon, je m'arrête après cette image. Et donc, personne ne veut qu'il parte. Donc déjà, un héros, encore une fois, c'est un demi-dieu. Donc il va avoir cette arrogance de partir, et ce qui va le faire devenir héros, ce sont les épreuves. Donc tout ce qui ensuite vient contester cette liberté que vous prenez, par exemple, quand vous décidez d'être écrivain, finalement vous conforte dans cette folie que vous êtes un héros. Et par ailleurs, oui, c'est quelque chose que... alors voilà, je dirais le par ailleurs après.
I agree with what you're saying in that once I began to write, when suddenly this opened up, like many, I had this in the background, in my pockets, but suddenly I knew, and from that point on, there was no time to waste or to do anything else. I mean, I have a somewhat obsessive temperament, and so I did that. I wrote. And that's where the image of the hero is useful, and where it's not just a childlike thing. Novels, or books in general, are spiritual exercises, to quote Loyola. There is a moral aspect to them. So, what is a hero? If we go to the first hero, Ulysses, Ulysses is the one who leaves. Now, no one wants him to leave. As a hero, he is a half-god, and he has this arrogance to say, I'm going to leave. Now, the way that he becomes a hero is to go through the trials and challenges that he's going to face once he leaves. So, all of that is part of this freedom that one takes when one becomes a writer. All these challenges and trials reinforce us in this folly that we are a hero.
Well, it helps sometimes. Yeah. And I like that a hero gets lost. It really always helps me that the hero in all the stories, the hero is on the road, and then they see a light in the woods, and they like, should I go? Should I not go? And they go, and horrible things happen, But somehow they get back on the road, and But it's when I've been lost as a writer or as a human being, I always feel very, forgiven by that thought,
Oui, et je voulais ajouter que quand je dis exercice spirituel, c'est pas seulement pour soi. On n'écrit pas pour soi. Enfin, c'est pas ça. Mais c'est justement aussi d'essayer de dire au lecteur, parce qu'on est tous empêchés, freinés par mille choses et par nos peurs, bien sûr. Et d'essayer de montrer, de montrer il y a le côté exemplaire du livre toujours, et des personnages qu'on dessine, qu'on écrit, et de montrer, en fait, on est plus libre qu'on croit. Et vous pouvez y aller. Et peut-être que vous aurez des emmerdes, mais c'est pas grave. Ça vaut le coup. Plutôt que d'insister, d'autres écrivains le font sur les angoisses. Mais c'est justement, c'est faire face à l'angoisse. C'est pas dire qu'elle n'existe pas. C'est le point de départ.
If you want to start thinking of questions after the translation, we're going to open it up to some questions from the audience.
I want to add that when I say a spiritual exercise, it's not just for yourself or for myself. One doesn't write for oneself, or it's not exactly that. It's to try to say to the reader that all of us are prevented or slowed down by 1,000 things, and notably our fears. So it's to try to show through the exemplary nature of the book and the characters that we create, to try to show that we are more free than we think. To say, you can go for it. Yes, there'll be trouble along the way, but it's worth it. And to do that rather than insist, the way some writers do, on the anxiety of the thing. Yes, these anxieties exist, but they are merely the starting point.
And I think that's where the collective comes in. I think the spiritual part is the collective part. I mean, it's the only reason why anybody would want to enter into these voyages and coexist with it for 18 hours or however long it takes to read a book.
Thank you so much. Does anyone? Yes.
Thank you very much for the talk. I don't know if this is on. I can't hear a word, but I have kind of two questions, and I'll repeat them in French and in English. In English, the question is, why do you write, both of you? And the other one is, as you've had success in your lives, or beginning to have success, have you seen a change in the way that you write, or what you actually, how you interact with the public? In the sense that when you're writing a book, is it for you, or does the reception that you get change the art that you make? Si je peux dire en français, merci beaucoup pour le discours. Les deux questions sont pourquoi vous écrivez. Et l'autre partie, c'est est-ce que vous avez vu un changement avec l'écriture que vous faites selon les réponses des gens en public? C'est tout.
I mean, I think I write because I don't want to be alone, you know? And I think that one of the coolest things I've heard another writer say was on a panel, a poet named Louis Warsh said that when he was a child, when he first read, reading was the first experience he ever had of understanding that other people were thinking. Like he didn't know if he was the only one doing this thing. Because nothing about childhood makes you think that anybody is interested in this process going on. And so for me, it was right away, writing, keeping diaries since childhood was a way to reflect this inner thing going on that had no direction and no motive other than to be like, when you smoke a cigarette in the dark, it's very unsatisfying. You know, you sort of need to see the smoke, and I feel like writing for me is that.
Je pourrais tricher et dire que c'est pour être seul que j'écris. To be alone that I write. Oui, je pense que pour le coup c'est personnel, mais je pense qu'il y a de ça. Oui, j'aime organiser mes journées. J'aime le travail solitaire. Ça, je pense qu'il y a quelque chose de cet ordre-là. Et que par ailleurs, non, j'écris parce que je pense, je pense que ce qui se passe dans les livres, c'est effectivement là d'abord dans les livres que j'ai lus, j'ai passé beaucoup de temps à lire avant. Que c'est tout ce qui est... les vraies choses sont dans les livres. Les vraies choses qu'on n'arrive pas à exprimer, qui ne peuvent pas être exprimées, qui ne peuvent pas être dites. dans l'autre versant, le versant de la vraie vie, je ne sais pas si on peut dire, et qu'il faut que ce soit quelque part, que c'est quelque chose d'urgent. Et quand on peut non seulement lire ces choses-là dans les livres des autres, mais essayer de le faire soi-même, ça me paraît important.
I could cheat and say it's because it's to be alone that I write. But this is a personal thing, but there is some of that. I like solitary work, and also I write because I think that what happens in books, first in the books that I read, because I spent a lot of time reading earlier, the things that happen in books are the real things that can't be expressed, that can't be said in the other side, that side of so-called real life. And so there must be somewhere where these things can be found. And when you can read books where they're found or write those things yourself, I think that's important.
Et je poursuis et je réponds à l'autre partie de votre question. Oui, parfois on a le sentiment que ce qu'on semble comprendre de ce qui se passe, voilà, de l'existence, relève de la folie. Et si on l'écrit, qu'on le relit, qu'on se dit est-ce que c'est... Mais qu'on l'écrit non pas dans un journal, mais pour voilà, une écriture de livre, et donc on se relie avec cette distance, on dit j'ai l'impression que c'est vrai, et hop, on le donne et ça devient un livre. Et quand les lecteurs vous disent ah, ça m'a, oui, j'ai compris, c'est la même chose, moi aussi j'éprouve ça, on se dit ah très bien. Donc on est deux à éprouver la même chose, ça c'est la question, voilà, c'est pour ne pas être seul, c'est la question de la communauté, on est deux donc on n'est pas fou. Si on est deux à penser la même chose, on n'est pas fou. Et oui, ça, je crois que c'est une des raisons de tous les livres.
As for the other part of your question, I just have to reread because it...
You're doing great.
Yeah. I have the feeling that we understand our existence as if it were madness. And if I write it not in a diary, but to write a book, and then I reread it with that distance and decide that it's true, and then I give it over to make a book, and then I meet readers who say they feel the same way. Oh, good. There's two of us who feel this way, who understand things that way. That means we're not crazy. If there's two of us, we're not crazy. And I think that that's the reason for all books.
Yeah, and I wanted to add to the second. I just feel like just becoming known is a different problem. You know, it's to be unknown is a problem. You know, and you're making with the thought of this being a thing, and then a thing that people will see. But then once you've been making, and people see that thing, then it's sort of like it's actually much harder to get to that space where you're alone, just doing it. You know, because people, yeah, I mean, like literally, obviously, people offer you different things to do that are everything but writing. You know, and that's very strange. But mostly it really is the problem of one thing is kind of a minimalist problem, and the other one is sort of maximalist. And you're kind of trying to carve out a little space in the middle of all that stuff. You know, it's really the studio. You're making a different studio, or I am now.
Do you accept lots of things?
Yes, I accept too many things. And then I go into, it's like changing your diet, and then I go into like a phase where I accept nothing, and I say no to everything, and I think that's really great, and you start to, you know, have a new space. I mean, I felt so good in Paris. I thought, oh, I can do anything I want. And I was like, why don't I feel that way in New York or Marfa, you know? And it's like the known just becomes a burden, you know? And it's like you have to find the unknown in another place, even inside of you.
Do you feel that way about New York, being in New York? Does it?
Yes, absolutely. You know, but even when I'm in Paris, I try to pretend I'm not. It works.
Sorry, I know you had a question.
Oh, that's great. You talked about writing a book in first person, and you talked about the need to distance yourself from the first person, then you talked about the hero and so on. And then when one reads that particular book, it feels so autobiographical, and then when you read write-ups about it, they also say it's autobiographical. Can you explain the tension between the distance in yourself, the autobiographical characteristic of the book? Can you explain that?
Disons ma technique, les contraintes que je me donne sont de prendre les vrais éléments de ma vie. Bon. En l'occurrence, dans Love Me Tender, essentiellement, autour de cette histoire de difficultés que j'ai eues avec mon fils à ce moment-là. Mais il ne s'agit pas de... L'importance pour moi, c'est le rapport entre les événements et le personnage. Que le personnage, ce soit moi, la première personne, que les événements soient les événements de ma vie, est totalement vrai, peu importe. C'est la question du rapport. Et donc, c'est là qu'est la distance. C'est quelle est la pensée que montre ce rapport, en étant aussi factuel que possible, et précisément, en fait, la pensée qui est derrière le geste, en quelque sorte. Mais oui, enfin, c'est à la fois, on est... pardon. Non, voilà, j'ai fini.
My technique, to call it that, or the limitations or constraints I give myself, are to take the real elements of my life. Essentially, in Love Me Tender, that's the issues around the difficulties that I had with my son at that time. The important thing for me is the relationship between the events and the character. It's not important that the character in the first person is me. It's not important whether the events are real. It's the relationship between the two, and that's where the distance is. The real is in that relationship. There's a thought behind the gesture.
Yeah, I assumed that your book was based on some autobiographical things, but the reason it was interesting was not that. You know, what was interesting was to watch how you did it. You know, and I feel like that's the same thing I experience in my writing. It's sort of like I have this thing which is my life and my existence and my memories and stuff. But it's almost like a joke what I can make out of that, how I can take that stuff just like fabric and reshape it and redesign it and rearrange it and put it in different relations. I mean, it really is literally funny to me, and that is like the delight of making a book.
Yeah, absolutely agree.
It becomes other through arrangement.
I think we have time for one more question.
Well, first of all, thank you.
I think this person too. Let's have two questions.
Thank you for a beautiful conversation. And my question is, I want to return to the idea of the collective that you were talking about. And I see, especially Eileen, your work as advancing this kind of collective intellectual labor of how we all make sense of our culture or sexuality, whatever it is. And that's obviously a reading experience. And I'm wondering, from your perspective as writers, how you metabolize all of these ideas in our collective cultures. You know, the writers you mentioned, Michel T, Hervé Guibert, all of these people, how you metabolize and reference them, how intentional that is, and how that shapes your work.
Sometimes people are fellow travelers. They're just there. I mean, there are things I deliberately have to keep away from me. Like, Michel T, for instance, is a friend and a writer whose writing is very close to me. And so when I'm working on a book, if Michel has a new book, I can't look at it. You know, I just have to keep certain things at a distance because I feel like they will get in. But then other times, I mean, also, every book I've ever written, there are several books that were right on my shoulder with me. And sometimes I literally bring them in and they become companions and they're with me for a while and they shape the book too. So I feel like that, you know, so that I don't write alone, not even by choice, but by this kind of osmosis, you know, things, you know, and also there's often sorts of things. I don't know why I need to read travel writing for this book, you know, but that's the requirement, you know, and I do that, and then it comes in or not, you know, and it's a command almost.
Oui, mais c'est toujours l'idée qu'on est... Il n'y a rien de solitaire, en fait. Le langage n'est pas solitaire. Et donc, notre langage, n'importe quel livre n'est jamais seul. Et donc, on est de façon plus ou moins intentionnelle, parfois un peu plus, mais on est bien sûr fabriqué par... pas seulement par les événements de notre vie, justement, mais aussi par les livres qui nous ont... non seulement qu'on a aimé, mais où on se dit, ah oui, tiens, c'est ça. Et quand on se met à écrire, bien sûr qu'on prend des décisions. Il y aurait 1000 manières d'écrire. C'est pas juste on se lève et on marche, justement. Et donc on est... on peut, oui, il y a des choses un peu plus intentionnelles où on se dit, ah voilà, je vais aller plus vers là que vers là. Je me souviens que pour pas Love Me Tender, mais le premier, Playboy, je pensais beaucoup à Guillaume Dustan. Je ne sais pas s'il est traduit, je ne suis pas sûre, aux États-Unis. Si, peut-être, c'est mieux texte, oui. Et voilà, il y avait quelque chose comme ça qui se déroulait, qui me paraît, une langue qui était à la fois très simple et moderne, et qui pour moi était aussi pure que les moralistes français du XVIIe, et j'aimais bien ça. Donc voilà, non, on est jamais seul, c'est ça, c'est ça le langage, c'est ça qui est assez excitant et mystérieux aussi.
It's always this idea that nothing is solitary. Language is not solitary. Our language and no book is ever alone. More or less intentionally, we are made by not only the events of our life, but also the books, not simply that we loved, but those that made us say, oh, that's it. So when we write, we make decisions. There are 1,000 different ways of writing. It's not like standing and walking. There are all these intentional things. You decide to go more in this direction than in that direction. So with my first book, the one before Love Me Tender, Playboy, I thought a lot about Guillaume Dustan, who's published with Semiotext in translation. And there was something unrolling there, a language that was both simple and modern that seemed as pure to me as the French 17th century moralists, which I liked. So you're never alone with language. That's both exciting and somehow mysterious.
I went into the Boston Public Library sometime in the late 60s, and I picked up a book off the shelf, A Man Without Qualities by Robert Musil, and I thought, what a great title. And I pulled it out, and I looked at the beginning of the book, and he was talking about the weather, you know? And it only really recently I realized that I love the way I, you know, loving my own work. I love the way I ended Chelsea Girls with the line, "It was a hot summer day in 1979." And that's Robert Musil. Like, it took me, I don't know how many years it took me to use it, and then how many more years it took me to notice it, you know? And it's so weird, it's like traveling. It's like we have these little backpacks, and we have all this stuff in our backpack, and it's just there till you need it, you know?
So did we have a last question? Yeah.
Maybe it's a question more for Constance. I was wondering, now that you're completely committed to your writing, that it's something that seems to be like taking you completely, don't you think that sometimes your hero might decide for you, or might push you to do something in your life so that you can write about it?
Non. Non, bien sûr que non. C'est pas comme. Enfin, la question. En tout cas, pour la vie personnelle, on reste qu'on est. Enfin, ça, je crois que ça change absolument rien. La seule chose, c'est que. Alors, on n'est pas du tout. On ne devient pas un personnage. Voilà. La personne qu'on est ne devient pas un personnage. Mais l'autre question qui est celle des livres à écrire, c'est sans doute d'éviter autant que possible de refaire le même personnage. Enfin, je veux dire, faut que ça reste absolument juste et vrai, en fait. Mais non, je crois pas que ça. Enfin, non, je pense pas que ce soit comme ça que ça se passe pour personne. En fait, on peut pas vivre des choses pour se dire que ce sera peut-être bien dans un livre. Je pense pas.
No, of course not. Not in regards of one's personal life in any case. We remain what we are. It changes nothing. The person that one is doesn't become a character. Now, in terms of this other question of the books to be written, probably one must try to avoid as much as possible to redo the same character. One must ensure that one remains absolutely accurate and true. But I don't think that what you describe is true for anyone. I don't think that one lives things so that they are good in a book, or lives things to have something good for a book.
Or if you've done that, you realize you've made a terrible mistake.
Thank you. Thanks so much to Constance Debré, Eileen Myles, Stéphanie Lacava for this wonderful discussion. Thanks to Nicholas Elliott. So selection of the books in French and in English are available in the other room. If you want to buy one or get one side, it's the moment. Thank you so much.